Hello, and welcome to the last news report of the Gilded Age News. I'm Andy.
And I'm Marcella. Today's topic is our current urban problems.
This includes the issues of immigration, pollution, and poverty in the United States.
Society itself underwent significant changes in the period following the Civil War, most notably the rapid urbanization of the North.
First, let's discuss the immigration patterns that have occurred over the past 50 years, from 1850 to 1900.
During this time, over 16 million immigrants have arrived as our U.S. population grew from 23 million to 76 million.
You might be wondering why so many people have come to the United States. Well, there are many reasons why this fine country appealed to outsiders, especially Europeans.
These include displacement, overcrowding in their own countries, persecution, freedom, economy, new opportunities, and cheap transportation.
In fact, in 1860, 1/4 of the U.S. population was born in another country. The majority of the earlier animals were from the Western European nations of Germany, Ireland, Britain, and Scandinavia. They were called the Old Immigrants because they were the first wave.
Immigration from Italy, Greece, Poland, Austria-Hungary, the Balkans, and Russia became prominent in 1890, and these people were called the new immigrants.
Most immigrants left their homes seeking jobs and better financial opportunities in the United States. Some, like the Jews in Russia and Poland, left because of religious or political oppression. Most arrived with little money and no professional skills.
Many immigrants were young males who intended to stay in the country only long enough to earn some money and then return home, and, in fact, many did return. Others settled permanently here in the United States and saved money to pay for their loved ones to join them.
In 1870, people of foreign birth made up about 33% of the populations of U.S. cities with populations of 25,000 or more.
As immigration increased in cities, poverty rose as well. This leads us to our next urban problem.
Poverty became more apparent during the Gilded Age. It came about as a result of the Industrial Revolution. People no longer were self-sufficient farmers and no longer lived in their own homes.
That is very true, Andy. When immigrants in the working class moved into urban areas, they lived in the slums. Poverty was a consequence of social and economic conditions.
During this time, privately owned tenements were created to help with the scarcity of living areas for the poor people. These buildings were small apartment-like buildings that crowded a bunch of people into small areas.
Competitions between the architects began on who could build the best tenement. James E. Ware won the competition for tenement design. It was called the dumbbell tenement because it was shaped like a giant dumbbell. It reached 7 or 8 stories high and packed 30 4-room apartments on the 25 by 100-foot lot. Between 4 and 16 families lived on a floor with only 2 toilets in a hall.
Most people lived in tenements and in alleys and basements that were very dark. These areas had a very strong poverty smell. It was the smell of horse manure and the outside toilet, which was not healthy to people living there.
Contributing to that terrible smell, wastes of cities were dumped into the nearest bodies of water, and that same water was then used for drinking. Very little filtered water was available in these impoverished areas of the U.S.
Can you imagine having to drink that nasty water?
Yuck!
Along with the filth, suicide, alcoholism, and crime rates rose throughout the urban areas, and some youths formed gangs such as the Hayes Valley Gang, Baxter Street Dudes, Daybreak Boys, and the Alley Gang.
Relating to alcoholism, saloons were everywhere in urban areas, which were places where people went to drink. Anyways, let's move on to another reason that poverty struck in the Gilded Age.
The economic panic of 1893 caused a Great Depression throughout the U.S. Many railroads and other businesses became bankrupt during this time. This led to even more poor people and more solutions to be made to help house these struggling people.
For example, settlement houses were also built as residential neighborhood institutions intended to address the social problems of the urban poor. This was all part of the reform movement to reduce the poverty.
Leaders of these ideas were James Adams and Lillian Wald. What exactly did these houses do?
Good question. These houses dealt with new strategies to deal with political, educational, and economic impoverishment. Some houses were even associated with religious groups, and a lot of houses were filled with European immigrants.
It is also important that these houses pioneered kindergartners and daycare, taught English, gave citizenship classes, established theaters, provided courses in industrial education, offered legal aid, and sponsored music schools.
The Hull House was one of the first settlement houses built in an immigrant slum in Chicago.
How bad were the conditions of the slums?
The urban poor lived without clean air, fresh water, access to nature, had garbage and no plumbing, sewerage, or other sanitary devices.
As time went on and new technology was created and factories established, there was a high increase in pollution as well.
Water pollution was the result of all water waste being dumped into the water systems, and air pollution was the result of industrialization.
There was a decrease of wildlife and an increase of the human population.
Cities began to be built away from bodies of water, showing that it is not important anymore, and nature and cities were separating.
New York City and Boston faced physical limitations in size because of their location. Too many people were occupying the areas, and with so many people, more necessities were having to be produced, which meant more factory work and more pollution.
Thanks for tuning in for our last newscast of the Gilded Age News. I'm Marcella.
And I'm Andy, and we're signing off. Here's Marcella to give you a recap on immigration in recent years.
The immigrant population in the United States has increased over the past few decades. From 1990 to 2006, the number of immigrants rose from 20 million to more than 37 million.
Immigration is changing the composition of the nation's child population. 1 in 5 U.S. children and 1 in 4 low-income children has an immigrant parent.
Since so many immigrants work in low-wage jobs without benefits, their children face greater risks of poverty, economic hardship, and lack of access to health insurance, public benefits, child care, and other services.
Nationwide, immigrants are leaving the nation's cities for smaller cities, towns, and rural areas.
As the population spreads out, immigrant integration becomes a key issue for most American cities, not just a few traditional ports of entry.
Now we are going to talk about poverty in present-day America. Unfortunately, it still exists today and is a struggle to many living in the U.S.
A large and growing proportion of U.S. students live in poverty and even concentrated poverty, have a disability, and/or are learning English as a second language. In 2000, students who were eligible for free or reduced price meals made up at least half of the student body in 4 states.
Just 11 years later, over half of the public school students are poor in 17 states, including every southern state but Virginia and Maryland, and most western states. Student poverty is the dominant reality in schools in 3 of the biggest states, California, Texas, and Florida, and nearly the majority in New York, Michigan, and Illinois. The 21st century has sharply increased the proportion of parents who are unemployed, whose jobs do not pay enough to provide basic food, shelter, clothing, and health care for the children, and/or whose immigrant status limit their capacity to navigate the education system and restrict them to a shadow economy.
With the growth of people and technology comes issues. These problems can be extremely dangerous to our environment and are the main reasons for pollution. Here's Andy to talk to you about the top 4 pollution problems that are in the United States today.
Thanks for that brief but great introduction, Marcella. The 4 biggest pollution problems include climate change, loss of biodiversity, chemical pollution, and atmospheric aerosol pollution. Did you know that human activities are currently affecting the climate?
Another major issue is the loss of biodiversity. The Earth is currently in the midst of its greatest mass extinction since the death of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. As many as half of all plant and animal species that exist today could be extinct by 21,000, a rate that is estimated 1,000 times the natural rate of 0.1 to 1 species per million species per year.
This catastrophic loss of biodiversity is already likely to affect the development of life on Earth for millions of years to come.
So-called ecosystem services are believed to save human societies trillions of dollars every year by performing functions such as the following: purification of air and water, crop pollination, production of seafood, game and other wild foods, pest control, waste decomposition, soil creation, and drought and flood mitigation.
Now to focus on the different types of pollution, first is chemical pollution. This is the pollution of air, water, and soil by long-lasting chemical compounds. However, this is another tipping point that is hard to quantify, in part because many of the chemicals in question simply have not been around long enough for the long-term effects to be clear. Another type of pollution is atmospheric aerosol pollution, and Marcella will explain all about it.
Atmospheric aerosol pollution can be either natural or man-made. Unlike greenhouse gases, most aerosols have a net cooling effect on the climate because they reflect sunlight back into space instead of allowing it to warm the earth. Unfortunately, excessive aerosols are nevertheless undesirable because of their damaging effects on human and animal health, among other things.
Smog and other forms of air pollution contribute to chronic respiratory illnesses and even deaths for millions of people every year. In fact, the World Health Organization estimates that 2.4 million people every year die as a direct result of aerosols and other forms of air pollution.
This concludes the end of our Urban Problems Report. Thanks for listening. Until
later.